So in this lesson, we're going to go back and talk about something that's a little bit more fundamental to understanding music theory, and that's rhythm. And specifically with rhythm, we're going to talk about the notation. And the reason I'm kind of going back to this is traditionally with guitar players especially, we're not always the best readers. Or even if we do read music, we're not always connecting it to what we do. And specifically when you're talking about rhythm, again, we can always just talk about things in, normal terms, and we don't have to read music. But even for players that I don't think need to read single note stuff, right? You don't need to be able to read Bach or anything crazy like that. I do think it's important to be able to read rhythm after a certain level so that you can understand what an anticipation is, where you're landing on a beat, and how you can do things that are rhythmically complex while kind of being able to structure it in your head. So again, we're going to be focusing not on rhythm or not on reading necessarily on its own. We're going to be looking at the rhythm of reading and how we can read rhythms and again, just better ingrain them in our mind. You could technically do these without ever actually reading anything, but I think being able to apply it to the page lets you know, okay, this is what an eighth note looks like, this is how I remember it, and this is how I use it in reference, right? So the way that I like to approach this is I'm going to go over some terms that obviously I assume we're probably familiar at this point. But what I think we often don't do, again, because guitarists often don't read, or even if they do read, it's not something that's actively part of their practice. We're going to see how we can combine some of these common terms in our mind to compartmentalize and learn how our rhythms kind of work with one another. So this simple exercise that I'm going to do really only involves one string. And what we're going to start doing is we're going to just look at our different types of rhythms and try to play them one after another. So we're going to start just with rhythms that have, I guess you could say, a base of 2, that are divisible by 2, right? So we're going to start out with half notes, then we're going to move to quarter notes, then we're going to move to eighth notes, and then we're going to move to 16th notes. Now again, you might say, well, I've played all those, or I know what they are. But when we learn to play them all one after another, and specifically when we're learning to reference one after another, you get a better sense of, oh, okay, if I'm playing this passage, these are 16th notes, and you don't necessarily have to think about it as much, right? The more and more you play guitar and the more you improvise, you'll say, well, I could describe this if I was playing it, but I don't necessarily maybe know what this is in the moment. But the more and more you reinforce information like this, the more you go, oh, I'm playing a 16th note passage. Oh, I'm playing an eighth note passage. Oh, I need to slow down here, or this tempo is hard to do 16th notes at. And these things really start to inform your playing. So if we think about just going one up at a time, right? Normally, if we're just counting, we're counting 1, 2, 3, 4. We're just going to be in 4/4 for this, right? So if we're counting our half notes, we're just counting 1, 2, 3, 4, right? This is an instance where I'm just playing one rhythm at a time. So if I was to play my half notes, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then I was to go to my quarter notes, I'd be playing every single time I say a word. 1, 2, 3, 4, and let me let those ring out a little bit. 1, 2, 3, 4, right? So if I was to play my half notes for a measure, and then my quarter notes for a measure, it would sound like this. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, right? So we're just counting up to 4 since we're in the time signature of a 4/4, and I can just use that as a reference for my half notes and my quarter notes. But then if I get up to eighth notes, now I have to incorporate and, right? The word and, if I'm using a mnemonic device, helps me know where I'm at within that, right? Because now I'm playing 2 notes for every single beat, right? So I can't just say 1, 2, 3, 4 now because I'm playing at a subdivision that's faster than that. So that's where I can go to 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and, right? I'm being specific about where I'm lining up within that phrase. And then after that, obviously, it's 16th notes, right? And that's where I use the mnemonic device 1E and a. 1E and a, 2E and a, 3E and a, 4E and a. Now you might say, well, I know what those are, but I'm not really into playing and speaking out loud, or like, I don't really necessarily need that. But again, when you get into styles of music where someone goes, well, I need you to play on the E of 1, 1E, 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 right? They want you to do something like that. Well, it really helps to know all of these things and how they work off one another. Or you might go, well, I can play eighth notes really fast. But if you're reading something and it's switching from half notes to eighth notes, you might stumble for a second because you're not necessarily sure how it works. So we're going to do this simple exercise. This is on figure 1, and all I'm doing is I'm just walking up. I'm only going to be playing this C note, and I'm just going to start on half notes. I'm going to go to quarter notes. I'm going to go to eighth notes. I'm going to go to 16th notes, and then I'm gonna just reverse that. So after I'm at 16th notes, I go back down to eighth. I go back down to quarter, and I go back down to half, right? I assume you could obviously do whole notes, and I didn't want to make it too boring, but this is a nice simple exercise that literally just takes one string that, you know, I used to do when I was driving, or just wanted to do just to kind of reinforce, okay, now I kind of have my bearings. I know at this tempo how a 16th note feels, how an 8th note feels, how a quarter note feels, and knowing that, it helps me reinforce rhythms when I'm actually playing music. So I'm going to play a little click. Again, this is not a musical exercise. It's not something you're going to sing along to, but it is going to help reinforce the rhythms. So let's hear how it sounds. 1, 2, starting on half notes. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 E and a 2 E and a 3 E and a 4 E and a 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. And that's our exercise, right? Super simple. And again, it's just reinforcing, okay, this is this click at this tempo. Now I know what a 16th note feels like. Now I know what an 8th note feels like. Now, if you're someone who said, okay, that's pretty simple, I feel like I got it, what we're now going to do is we're going to talk a little bit more about triplets and groups of 3 and how those work within our time signatures, right? So we were before just playing quarter notes, we were playing 8th notes, we were playing 16th notes. But in all of those instances, we could play a quarter note triplet. We could play an 8th note triplet, and we could play a 16th note triplet. And sometimes, especially guitar players who like, you know, playing a little bit on the faster side, they're not always necessarily cognizant of if they're actually playing triplets or what type of note they're playing. And again, being specific about this helps you understand rhythms, because, you know, I remember when I was improvising, and if I wanted to do something fast, I would maybe try to play a 16th note, but it wouldn't fully be there. And then I would maybe try to play a 16th note triplet and go even fast. You know, I didn't necessarily have my bearings, but when you're very clear about this information and you're very clear about the tempo you're at, it really helps reinforce your playing, right? So my normal quarter notes were just 1, 2, 3, 4. If I was to do quarter note triplets, what that means is I'm going to be playing basically 3 quarter notes in the place of what would be a half note, right? So between 1 and 2 to the end of 2 would be 3 quarter notes. So my measure, right, if I was just doing quarter notes, would have 4. My measure of quarter note triplets would be 6. Right? And we're actually creating a polyrhythm. Whereas my underpinning rhythm is 4, I'm now starting to play what would be kind of like a 6/4 or a 3/2. Right? So it has this cool quality. If you look at when my foot's hitting, bum, 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 right? I'm hitting right on that third beat, right? So between the first beat and the second beat, you can hear I'm playing on that first beat, then the second beat, it's like, oh, these are not lined up. But come the third beat, they do line up, right? So it's this interesting quality. Again, it's not something we necessarily play on the guitar, and it is a little bit trickier, but when we're reinforcing this rhythm, we know what it is. So now we're going to play 8th notes, right? 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and, right? For each beat we're playing 2. Well, an 8th note triplet would have 3, right? Triplet, 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 triplet. So now I'm adding a note so that between my 8th note and my 8th note triplet, there is one more note, right? So there would be 8 8th notes that would happen within a measure of 4/4. But now there's going to be 12 8th note triplets that would happen within that measure. Now the device I'm using for triplets, and this kind of, you know, I've seen some debate about this. I personally like going triplet, 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 triplet. Now the downside with this is the fact that, well, that's a good way of feeling a triplet, but you'll notice that doesn't tell me where I'm at within the beat, right? That doesn't tell me that I'm on the third beat. It's just to reinforce that I'm playing triplets. So some people like to go 1 triplet, 2 triplet, 3 triplet, 4 triplet. That way, they actually know what number they're on, and they can still feel that 3 8th notes for every beat feel that a triplet has. Again, I just kind of like triplet because I think it helps me feel that feeling of 3 a little bit more, and it's probably what I just learned how to play triplets on, or, you know, when I was being specific about them. So it's something I gravitate towards, but again, it is helpful to know that. That way, when you're actually playing it, again, you can know where you're at within the measure. And then we can do the same version for 16th notes, right? Before we had 1 E and a 2 E and a 3 E and a 4 E and a, right? Now we're going to play 16th note triplets. That means for every beat, there is 6 notes. So that's 6, 12, 24 notes that would happen within a given measure, right? And this typically is the fastest rhythm that I think most guitar players are playing. There are, we could say, 30-second notes and faster subdivisions and all these things, but more often than not, if you're being clean and precise, I think 16th note triplets are kind of the fastest subdivision that we have, right? And again, this is where it gets a little tricky because that mnemonic device that I was using, triplet, I basically just have to do that twice as fast. Triplet, 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 right? Which is kind of a mouthful. And again, I could kind of take from that other way that I said I could say triplets, which would be 1 triplet, 2 triplet, 3 triplet, and I can go 1 triplet and triplet. So 1 triplet and triplet, 1 triplet and triplet. But I found when I did that, I wasn't really able to mnemonically keep up with what I was actually playing because, again, it is so fast. So that one is something that I think you do have to feel a little bit more because the mnemonic device, I mean, unless you're someone that is able to talk at those speeds, it can be a little bit hard to keep up with the actual rhythm, right? So if my beat's here, I'm trying to play 6 notes for every one of these notes. Right? So that's how I feel those 16th note triplets. And now a great exercise, again, this is kind of going off of the same exercise where, yes, you might know what each one of these individual notes are, but when you have to be clear and precise about them, and again, if you're reading something or hearing something for the first time, you might not always be precise and going, well, obviously I know what an 8th note is, but for some reason, I just didn't initially hear that this was an 8th note. Or going from this 8th note to this 16th note triplet, that weirded me out for a second because I just wasn't anticipating a change like that. I usually only play them, you know, kind of on their own. So we're going to do this exercise. This is figure 2. And again, this is an exercise that you can just kind of tap in your head or in your car. You can do it on a steering wheel if you want to. Obviously, if you're still being safe and looking at the road, of course. But it's still, you know, an exercise that's really just almost a mental game. I'm just going to play a single note here. But what I'm going to do now is I'm going to play just the original, you know, type of note. I'm going to play a quarter note. And then I'm going to go to a quarter note triplet. Then I'm going to go to 8th notes. Then I'm going to go to an 8th note triplet. Then I'm going to go to 16th notes. Then I'm going to go to a 16th note triplet. And then the phrase will end, right? And what's tricky about this is even if we were just doing, you know, groups of 3, it might be easier to go from one note to another. But when you have to shift back to 2, it kind of has this pushing motion, right? Because, oh, all of a sudden I'm dividing into 2, right? When I'm going from 8th notes, 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and a triplet. Right? It's almost like we're kind of pushing and pulling. It's almost like changing keys in a way when you're playing music. You're like, oh, well, this is, I guess, the same thing. I just kind of shifted my feel. Or when you go from like a major sound to a minor sound, you're like, it still works, but it was just kind of a jump that I have to readjust to, right? So that's the same kind of thing we're thinking when we hear this exercise. So again, let's just read this down and you can feel how these rhythms kind of work off of one another. So let's hear it with the click. 1, 2, ready, and. So you can hear, even with that, you know, you're kind of fighting with yourself when you go from an 8th note triplet to a 16th note, because all of a sudden you're feeling this, you know, you're feeling all of these groups of 3 and that kind of whole pulse shifting all of a sudden to this very rigid kind of, you know, divisible by 2 rhythm. So this is a good exercise, like I said, just to in your mind kind of segment what's happening where. Obviously the BPM can be a little tricky. We're at 69 BPM with this one because when you're doing things like quarter notes, it's such a slow subdivision that, you know, you're like, oh, I wish I had an 8th note so I could feel this a little bit better, right? But once you get up to the, you know, 16th note triplets, then it's really fast, right? So again, even if you're someone that can't alternate pick this fast, it's still a good exercise just to be thinking in your head or maybe just tapping with 2 hands, right? And even if you tap with 2 hands, you can see how with alternate picking, I'm going to end up, you know, when I'm doing just 8th notes, 1 E and every time I pick, it's going to be in the same direction once I land on a beat. But if I'm doing a group of 3, triplet, triplet, triple, I'm alternating between up and down, right? The first beat, I'm doing down. The second beat, I'm doing up, and so on and so forth. So Doing this again, even if you're someone that you feel confident with rhythm or you feel confident with reading, this is going to help reinforce some of those things. And it's just a good reference point. Again, sometimes I like to just do this exercise to get my bearings with, a certain rhythm. If I'm about to read something, or if I kind of just want to, work up that muscle a little bit, I'll just do this in the car for a second, almost like a little bit of a warm up to go, okay, I have my bearings. I know where each of these subdivisions sits at a given tempo, and I'll know how to better attack it when I need to do something musical.